Hi, everyone. I'm Ario from the Authors at Google program, and I'm very happy to introduce Scott Berkun today, who's our speaker. He's going to be talking about public speaking, and he's famous for just having great pieces that he writes on his blog, and he's written 3 excellent books for O'Reilly. So please give him a warm welcome, and I'll hand it off to Scott.
How you doing? Can you hear me okay? Volume good? Loud enough in the back? Still awake? Good? Excellent. Okay, so my first confession I want to share with you is that I am not an extrovert. I am not someone who, at the age of 5, told my mom, I want to be a public speaker when I grow up. That is not who I am. And the fact that I've written a book about public speaking is kind of an odd story. And the story goes something like this. I actually believe in ideas. I'm a creative person. I believe in ideas and learning about ideas and sharing them and trying to think better and share stuff that I find that's important or can make the world better. That is why I quit my job to write books. But a funny thing happens when you do anything interesting. A funny thing happens when you write, and you write books, is that people want you to talk about the stuff that you've written. And in all the stuff that I've done about the history of innovation, a lot of my work is on creative thinking and the history of how ideas become things and affect the world. That's one of the threads that runs through all those stories too, is that if you invent a cure for a disease, if you create something that earns a patent, eventually someone's going to want you to come and talk about those ideas, and the quality of how you talk about your ideas is going to affect how they perceive the quality of the actual ideas themselves. So I've sort of stumbled backwards into becoming a public speaker, and that I recognize that if you care about ideas and you care about progress, that eventually your communication skills are really the gating factors to what you can make happen in the world. So I quit my job. I used to work at Microsoft. I worked on Internet Explorer in the early days, but I quit my job at Microsoft in 2003 to write books. And as a side effect of writing books that have had the good fortune to be successful, I've done lots and lots of public speaking. I've been on national television. I've been on NPR. I've been flown all over the world to give lectures on stuff, basically, that I had written about, which, if you think about it, is a really kind of lousy reason to hire someone to speak. Because just because you can write well has almost no bearing on the fact that you can speak well. So over the course of the last 10 years or so, I've probably given hundreds of lectures. I've taught college courses. I've taught workshops. I've been on all different kinds of media. And because I care about ideas, I've become someone who cares a lot about communication. And I felt like of all the books I had seen or come across about public speaking, they all tend to be very dry and kind of generic. And I know from my own mistakes that I have all these fantastic stories of doing really stupid, embarrassing things in front of other people. And I've learned from those mistakes how to do this stuff well. And that's what the book is about. It's a capturing of all the stuff that I have, all the stuff that I've talked about, all the stuff that has gone wrong for me, and what the lessons are that can be learned from anyone else. Now, for any of you who are following along, any Twitterers here, any Twitter users, anybody? A couple of you? If you want to tweet as we're going, you want to blog as you're going, you want to take pictures of me or send smoke signals, you're free to use whatever media you want at all, because I'm here promoting the book. So feel free to distract yourself from what I'm saying if you're going to talk about what I'm doing to people who aren't here. Now, the first thing you should know about public speaking, is that we are all public speakers, that everyone speaks all the time. And on average, the average American says about 12,000 words a day. 12,000 words a day. Now, of course, since there's no actual average person, there's probably no one person who just says 12,000 words. Some people say as few as 5, some people say as many as 20. We all have a friend who probably says more than 20,000 words a day that we'd rather that they didn't. But we're all speakers. And in our ordinary lives, the fact that you have a job, the fact that you have friends, the fact that you have a girlfriend or boyfriend, the only way that you communicate and share life with them is through speaking and telling stories and explaining what it is you're trying to do with your life. So we are all inherently good speakers. Anyone who's listening to this conversation, listening to me talk right now, we're all good speakers. The problem, though, is as soon as you get into an environment where you are like I am right now, at the front of the room with a microphone, with a bunch of people who you don't know staring at you, all the dynamics start to change. It gets kind of weird now. You feel judged. You feel you're going to be challenged. You feel vulnerable. And because of those feelings, your natural abilities to tell stories and to communicate clearly diminishes. The other problem that we have when it comes to public speaking is that most of the public speaking that we experience in our lives, in high school and in college, is really bad. Like, most public speaking is bad. It's boring. It's dull. There's a reason why the word lecture is not a compliment. It's kind of an insult. It's a pejorative. People say, stop lecturing me. So we know that there's all these bad habits that most people have when they speak. But whenever it's our turn, whenever most people get the opportunity to be up in front of a room, the thing they do is repeat all the same mistakes they saw other people do because they think that's just how it's done. So what I'm going to do for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to pick the stuff that most bad speakers do and explain to you how not to do it, which is the easiest, most low-hanging fruit way in the world to get better at being a speaker. And the first one, actually, before I jump into the first one, these are the 6 I'm going to talk about. It'll take me about 25 minutes to get through all this stuff, and then about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. So as I'm going along, if I'm not talking about the thing you hoped I would talk about when you came into this room, keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to talk about those things that I didn't get to. So these are the 6 things that most bad speakers do. Now, the first one is the obvious one, which has to do with fear of public speaking. So how many of you get nervous before you give a pitch or talk at a meeting or give a lecture? How many of you have a fear of public speaking? Just raise your hand. Okay. So that's about 70% of you. So the rest of you are liars. You are liars. And the reason you're liars is not necessarily because you're fully aware that you're lying, but there's a fact that's biological that explains the fear response people have when they're speaking. And it has to do with the oldest part of your brain. A part of your brain is called the amygdala, which is in the core of your brain. It's about the size of a peanut. And it's kind of scary when you think about this tiny part of your brain. That's what controls a lot of really important stuff. Controls your heart rate, controls your adrenaline, fight or flight response stuff. And we have very little control over it. By design. By design. Because the amygdala thinks it's smarter than you are. Now, evolutionarily speaking, millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, that's where the programming for the amygdala was generated. If you were a creature standing alone on a field in front of a large crowd of other creatures who were staring at you that you didn't know, that would be bad. That would mean you're going to die or you're going to get eaten. That's what it would mean, one of those two things. So the creatures who found this cool and had a positive response to this stuck around and died. Those ancestors no longer are around anymore. The ones who were afraid of it, who were freaked out by that kind of environment, are the ones who run away, and those are our great-grandparents and great-grandparents, grandparents, whatever. We are descendant from that line of genetics. So that means that whenever you get up in front of a crowd, whenever you're going to pitch an idea to someone, even if it's in a small group, you're going to feel that fight or flight response kick in. Because biologically, your body's telling you, based on millions of years of programming, this is bad. This is dangerous. So you can't control that. You cannot entirely control that. And in all the research I did for the book, I could not find a single example, not one example, of a famous performer, a rock star, an athlete, anyone who performs regularly in front of crowds that did not admit they got nervous before they performed. It's a universal fact because it's biological. What this means, though, if you're going to speak, it means that sometimes you will be nervous for reasons that have nothing to do with how smart you are, nothing to do with how well you've prepared. It's a physiological response that you cannot control. So the first thing you have to do then is acknowledge, okay, I am going to be nervous. I can't shut that off. I have to take responsibility for all the things that I can take care of. I have to take responsibility for those. Now the first one, which is really obvious, if you think about it, is if your body's going to have a physiological response, you want to make sure you get exercise that day. The average American gets way below what their genetic disposition is for how much exercise they need to get. So if you actually exercise your body that morning and exhaust your body's natural fear response energy, that nervous energy, you'll be way calmer because your body's calmed down. So it's physiological. Physiological problem, solve it through physiological means. The other thing you have to think about are all the things that are within your control, which means like getting to the place early, which helps your body calm down, that you're in the environment you're going to be speaking in. Or whatever material you use, you have to practice it. All this stuff that people tend to discount as being irrelevant to the fear, those are things you can control. You have to make sure that you take care of those things. Now, the second thing that many speakers do that's a problem is that they allow themselves to be perceived as never having done what they're doing before. That they make it look like it's their first time. And no one in the world wants to be a guinea pig. No one wants to feel like they are the experiment. This is the first time this guy has ever done this demo. So that's why he hasn't figured out how it works, and he's going to spend 10 minutes fiddling with his laptop. No one wants to feel that way. And although it's more of a superficial complaint about speakers in general, if you take the time to make sure that you practice all the things that you do so it seems natural to you, it makes it much easier for people to follow along with whatever it is you're saying. So there's an obligation you have if you're speaking. There's probably about 100 people in this room right now, and there's only one of me. If I'm going to spend an hour talking, that means there's 100 hours that are being spent by you listening. If I'm not going to practice for a couple of hours, then I am creating, public speaking hour debt. Because there's 97 or 99 hours that are being spent by you and only one that's spent by me. If I don't practice, I'm effectively telling my 1 hour is more important than your 99, which is really an offensive kind of way to think about public speaking. So anything you do, anything you're going to talk about, anything you're going to show, you have to practice it. So at least it feels natural to you. And it makes it easier for people who are going to follow along with whatever it is that you're going to say. My third point has to do with rhythm. Are any of you guys musicians? Even amateur musicians? Anyone play guitar? What do you play in the back?
Play guitar.
Guitar. Any drummers? Percussion? No drummers. We'll have to rely on you then, my friend.
Wow.
Do you play rhythm guitar?
Sometimes.
Okay, there we go. All right. So it turns out, and you'll know this, it turns out that we are all rhythmic creatures. We all have a heart rate that's relatively constant that gives us a steady pace for how we absorb all the information that's out there when we're trying to pay attention. There's a beat that exists just within us. And one of the main problems in most lectures and most public speaking is that the pace is always really slow. Lectures are boring because the pace is slow. And that's a problem. But what's worse than a slow lecture is a slow lecture that's erratic. So I have a picture up here of a turtle for a reason. So turtles are slow. No argument there. Anyone want to argue about that? Turtles slow? Turtles are slow. I've never seen a fast turtle. The only thing worse, and I know in my life sometimes I get frustrated if I'm standing behind someone in line who's slow because I'm waiting for them to do their thing. I got to get past them. The only thing that's worse than being behind a turtle is being behind a turtle that's on drugs. So a turtle on drugs is still slow. You're not going to fix that through biochemistry. But turtle on drugs is now going to be erratic. So it's slow and erratic, which is much worse. Because slow and predictable means you at least know, okay, it's going to take a certain amount of time for this guy to get through his stuff, then he's going to move on to the next thing. Slow and unpredictable means you're going to have this kind of experience where you're going to be in the audience, someone's in the audience, you're going like, he's been going for 20 minutes. Like, has he started yet? What is he talking about? That's a turtle on drugs. It's someone who's not figured out that there's pace and rhythm that's important anytime someone's speaking. And if the person speaking isn't controlling their pace and their rhythm in some way, it's very difficult for people to follow along. In doing research for the book, one of the angles I took was to dig up all the research that had been done about lecturing and all the cognitive psychology and the cognitive science about what goes on in our brains when we're listening to lectures. And to condense that down in a fairly unscientific and made-for-television kind of way, the best basic rule of thumb about attention is most people, on average, can pay attention for about 5 to 10 minutes. That's a sweet spot number for if you're going to make rough assumptions about crowds of people, that's your number, 5 to 10 minutes. So that means if ever you're giving a lecture, it's going to be a half hour, or you're giving a talk, or anything that goes longer than that, you have to be thinking about how to construct your material in units of 5 to 7 minutes, creating a rhythm that's going to be easier for people to follow along with. Very basic. One mistake most people make, though, is when you're doing a presentation or giving a pitch, or usually use either Keynote or PowerPoint. Who here has used Keynote or PowerPoint in the last week? Okay, most of you, right? The flaw is people usually think then in terms of slides. How many slides am I going to have? But a slide is not a measure of time. So if you're thinking about your presentation, oh yeah, I got 30 slides, that seems about right. You could end up spending 20 minutes talking about one slide, or maybe go quickly through 30 slides and only do that within 5 minutes. So you have to be thinking about the pace chronologically rather than in terms of the content and material. You're trying to make it easy for people to follow along through what you're going to say. The other bit of research that I dug up, which is pretty fun, although lecturing is the dominant form of communication that teachers use and professors have used for probably hundreds of years, there's been very little research done as to what's actually going on physiologically for people who are in the audience. So there's this guy, Bly, who's a professor and a researcher, who wrote this excellent book about all the science behind teaching. And in the book, he explains a study that he did that no one had ever done before. He's a professor, and he's like, hey, I want to find out what's actually going on for people who are listening to lectures. So he took his class of college students, strapped them all up to heart rate monitors, and then lecture to them. And this is what happened. You know, not a surprise, because most of you probably went to college and you fell asleep in at least one class. I'm sure. How many of you fell asleep in at least one class? Yeah, it's just part of the process, right? We know. But there's actually data. He's like, look, your bodies are clearly not built to be lectured to. We're built to hunt and gather and do all kinds of active things. And sitting and listening is entirely passive. So this means if you're a speaker, and again, you're speaking for a length of time, you have to do something to help people's natural physiology work with you rather than against you. So instead of being a turtle on crack or turtle on drugs, where you have an inconsistent rhythm, you know, it doesn't really make any sense, you need to be constructing your stuff with a pace that at least is clear to you. Preferably, it's clear to whoever you're talking to, that you're telling them, I got 5 things to say, I'm going to spend 30 minutes going through those 5. Then at least people know there's a pace they can follow. One question I get asked a lot is what to do when people start losing interest. What do you do when people start tuning out? And my answer to that question is always the same. It's like people tune out all the time, especially today in 2009 with all the things we can carry with us that are fun distractions. People tune out all the time. Or they start thinking about, did I walk the dog this morning? I can't remember. Or what am I going to have for dinner tonight? There are all these things that run through people's minds. And that's fine. But if you don't provide a rhythm, you don't provide a pace, then when they tune out, they're probably gone for the entire lecture or the entire talk. If you provide some kind of rhythm, then you give a trigger that they'll hear. They'll go, oh, wait, oh, all right, I'm in a lecture now. What is he talking about? Oh, he moved on to the next point. Okay. And there's some way for them to come back in. You never want to be in a position where you go on for 30 minutes and people who've tuned out, they have no way they can possibly come back in and join the rest of the crowd. And speaking of crowds, I mentioned earlier on, I sort of gave you a compliment for being a human being and that we're all good at speaking. It's something we all do. But I have to admit that there are people who can make anything boring. That you could have a super exciting thing happen. You could be in a car accident or meet a famous person on the street who gives you $1,000 just because he liked you that day. Some amazing story. And then you go somewhere else and you're about to tell that story to other people and your friend starts telling the story and he totally blows it. He tells it in the most long-winded way. He starts talking about what he had for breakfast that morning and just rambling on and on. You're like, oh my God, because you were there and you know what happened. So it's possible, despite all of our natural instincts for communication, it is possible to make anything boring. Typically, by including too much. Typically, when you include too much, it makes things boring. If your goal is to be comprehensive, it makes things boring. Good stories are never comprehensive. Never, ever comprehensive. They have a narrative, they have a hook, they have some line of thinking that's interesting or piques your curiosity, and they run with that hook. So, the bad news is there are some people, and maybe some of you, I haven't had anything exciting happen yet with you in the room that I can tell how you would tell a story about it, but while it's possible that you can make anything boring, the counterpoint, which is good, is that it's also possible to make anything interesting. You can make anything interesting, and that's what good storytellers do. That's what good speakers do. That's what good salesmen do. They find a way to make the thing they're talking about interesting to you. And I have 2 tricks for this. 2 tricks that make it easier to do. The metaphor that works best is to think of a pitch where you're trying to convince someone of something or a meeting or a presentation, to think of it as a path. You as the pitcher, as the presenter, you're trying to create a path that people can follow along on. They want to make it so they're interested all the way through. And the metaphor works best when you think about people are going to take the next step if they're interested. The word interesting is probably the best word when you're thinking about trying to keep people's attention. And there are 2 easy ways to use that word to your advantage. Now, the first one is the easiest, but it's low-hanging fruit. Doesn't have a huge payoff. And that is, if ever you're trying to convince someone of something, you have something you want to talk about, some knowledge you want to share, you have to make sure you found an angle to talk about it that at least you're interested in personally. That you found a way to find meaning in whatever it is so it matters to you. All of the research about communication and speaking and teaching, there's this factor that's entirely, I don't want to say superficial, but we put a lot of weight on people's enthusiasm. It makes a huge difference. People's retention, their ability to pay attention, their ability to learn and recall facts goes up when the person who gave those things to them was enthusiastic. So, how do you become enthusiastic? Well, you have to make sure whatever you're talking about, you found a way to think about it, however boring it might be, you found a way to think about it that at least is interesting to you. And the trick for this, one trick is to think about, instead of the technology that you're talking about or the information you're talking about, which is kind of abstract and maybe kind of boring, but to think about the effect you want that information to have on the world. That it can have an effect that you care about. And that's the passion that you need to make sure carries on through in whatever it is that you're talking about. Whether that's a line of code, whether that's some idea for a product or feature, think about the effect. It's much easier to get excited about effects and people and the effects your idea or that thing can have on people. So that's the easier one. The harder one, which is a higher payoff but requires more work, is to think about the people who are in the audience and why they're there. Many people, when they present, they give a lecture, or even when they teach a college course, they get wrapped up in themselves. Well, what do I want to talk about? Or how should I make this slide? Ooh, this is a fun story to tell. And it becomes very selfish and egocentric, which, if you think about the world from a design or user experience perspective, is a fatal mistake. And instead, what you want to do is say, hey, why are these people coming? They have 1,000 other things they could do. Why are they going to sit here and listen? What are the questions they're likely to have? What did I put in the description that set them up? What expectations are they going to have? How do I take all the knowledge or wisdom or stories that I have and put that in a format that's interesting to the people who are coming? Does not take a whole lot of work to do this, especially if you're speaking somewhere where there's a host who's invited you in, or it's a conference, or it's an event of some kind. They have data about who shows up and why, how old they are, what degrees they have, what background they have, how many years they've been in the industry, or there's 1,000 questions that you can ask that all of a sudden feed your thinking as to what the artifact of a presentation, what problem it's intended to solve for the people who show up. Most of the time, when you are bored, it means the person who's speaking, and if you're bored right now, this applies to me as well, it means the person who's speaking did not think carefully enough, or possibly not even at all, about why you're here. Don't ever let that happen to you. If you're thinking clearly about why people are there, even if you don't like public speaking, even if you don't think of yourself as charismatic, even if you talk into your shoes, if you're talking about stuff people really care about, they will pay attention. You know, a simple trick is to think about, people talk all the time about how to keep people's attention, as if there's some gimmick to it. But if I were to switch gears and say what this lecture is really about was, I'm going to give away $500 million at the end of this lecture. And I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes about how I'm going to choose who gets the money. All of a sudden, it's interesting. No matter what superficial things as a speaker I'm not doing well. On the other end of the spectrum, you could have Tony Robbins or Barack Obama or some great charismatic speaker, and if you asked him to speak for 20 minutes about who's going to help with his taxes or something, your interest level would drop. So a lot of the whole game is matching the stuff that you think you're supposed to share, you have that's valuable, to the people who are there, and make sure that Venn diagram is a rich Venn diagram, that you're covering both stuff that make it interesting to you, but also make it interesting to them. So instead of being the kind of guy who tells these long-winded stories and is comprehensive, you've thought about it carefully, you've at least found a way to make it interesting to yourself, maximally you found a way to think about why people are there, and you're solving those problems for them. We're on the home stretch now. I have 2 more of these, so if you're thinking, man, he still hasn't talked about my thing, keep it in mind, because we'll have Q&A in about 10 minutes, maybe 8 minutes, 7 minutes, 5 minutes, soon. So, this point has to do with being smart. And you guys are all smart. A lot of smart people out there. Smart people often make a smart person's mistake when it comes to presenting and pitching. Because there's this habit that many smart people have of when you're in an argument and you start to lose, you increase the syllable count per word. Like the vocabulary complexity goes up. And you're betting that at some point you'll use a word that the other person doesn't understand. And since you're in an argument, they're not going to say, I don't know what that means. They're just going to back out of the argument, and you're going to win by like technical knockout. That you've now done this. Oh, okay, you win. You're like, yes. Does not actually mean that your argument was sound. It means you used kind of a technicality, a word they didn't know, to win. So this habit is a defensive way to communicate. You are actually literally, you're trying to push people away. And anytime I see someone use a lot of jargon, anytime I see someone making choices where they are picking complex words rather than simple, even though a simple one is probably just as good, they are saying, back off. I am pushing you away. I really don't want you to understand. I don't really want you to follow along on my path. I'm pushing you away. That's a response many smart people have when they're up here because we feel vulnerable up here. We feel like we're going to be attacked. We want to push people away. The goal instead, though, of allowing rhetoric to be the flaw is to think again about what the whole purpose of all of this is. If you're actually speaking about something you care about, then you want people to follow along. If you have an idea you're trying to convince someone to adopt or give you money for or support in some way, you want them to be on your side. So this approach of being complex first is never going to work. Instead, you have to be thinking the opposite way. What's the simplest way I can explain what it is my purpose is? I'm trying to make the world better. Well, how? Whatever the high-level goal is, you have to make sure that becomes clear first and enthusiastically. And then you follow up with your things that are more complex and more advanced, assuming people can follow along with you. And I studied philosophy in college, and there's this thing about rhetoric that is very important when it comes to speaking. And it has to do with the difference between points and arguments. Points and arguments. A point is the message, the 5 things you want people to leave with, or the actions you want them to take. That's the point of what you're doing. Whether that's a pitch, whether that's an idea pitch, whether that's a status meeting, there's a set of things you want to make clear. And those have to be crystal clear. There should never be someone who leaves listening to you and is not clear on what your points were, which is separate from the arguments for those points. The arguments that support the points, okay, maybe people won't agree with those, will be confused by them, they didn't fully understand my rationale, but they should never understand the purpose that I was trying to get across. So points and arguments. And many times, when you're in a bad lecture, a bad presentation, they've never figured out, the speaker has never thought through enough to clarify what the points are and what the arguments were. Instead, it's just this blob of facts and stories and data that doesn't make any sense. Coherence comes largely from, before you sit down and make a slide, writing down what the things are you want people to leave with. The 5 things they should learn, the 5 new ideas they should have, the 5 questions they should now be prepared to answer. If you don't know what those 5 things are, then there's almost no chance that anyone's going to leave with anything at all. So points and arguments. Make sure your points are clear. And I highly recommend not starting in PowerPoint or Keynote when you start a talk, because that will largely get you on the track of putting this stuff in, because it's fun to do. Makes you feel like you're making progress quickly. But you really have not thought at all about your audience. You have not thought at all about the things you want them to leave with. That requires your brain. No software tool can really do that for you. Speaking of software and slides, I'm not a huge believer in slides being the problem. We're almost done here. If you do the 4 or 5 things I've talked about already, then by the time you get to making slides, most of your problems that people create with slides will go away. But I have to talk about it at least for a minute. So this is a very typical kind of slide. This is a generic template you can find in almost any presentation tool with a bulleted list and a title at the top. And there are all these rules you might have heard about, like how to do these well, 7x7. Has anyone heard of the 7x7 rule? There's a rule for this, that you're supposed to, if ever you have bullets, you should have, this is my bad advice voice. If ever you have a bulleted slide, you should have 7 bullets and never more than 7 words per bullet. Sounds like, okay, now who made this up? Like, what research did they do on this? Like, no idea, because there probably isn't any. When I see a slide like this, I'm always, especially when someone asks me to look at their slide deck, like before they're going to give a talk, I know right off the bat this is someone who has made a bunch of the mistakes we've talked about already. First, it probably means they didn't practice. They don't know what they're going to say. So they've listed a whole bunch of stuff in the hopes that one of those things will make sense when they're up here speaking. Second, if they haven't practiced, it increases the odds when there's this much density on the screen, they're going to do this. And they're going to turn and talk to their slides. Because there's almost a conversation, so much language here, they're going to end up having a conversation with their slides. And turning your back on your audience is a whole bunch of very bad things. I mean, in some countries, when you do this, you will get killed for this. It's like not appropriate to do. And it also, any energy or enthusiasm, theatrically, should be directed at the audience. So as soon as you turn, even if you're just going back and forth, it diffuses your energy, which is a bad thing to do. The other problem with this kind of stuff, bulleted lists tend to make speakers feel like they are obligated to speak to everything on there. So it becomes comprehensive again. Now there's all this stuff that I feel like I got to say this and then I got to say that, which is boring and repetitive, and you're unlikely to be enthusiastic about it. So when you have this much visual density in terms of language, there's a lot of stuff here, usually means they didn't practice, did not think what their points were. right off the bat. The other end of visual density has to do with actual visual graphic design stuff. So this is another slide. This is an actual slide from the Department of Defense, and it's a report on the Iraqi war from a couple years ago. And when I see this slide, without knowing the speaker, without knowing anything about it, I also can make another set of assumptions, which again are similar to the first one. Does not know what he's going to say when this is up. There's so much data here, visually and dimensionally. I mean, he's got orange squares and red squares and like gradient squares, and there's like this huge tree of the complexity of stuff here. You could talk for hours about the data represented here, which is not what you want to do when you're talking. That's bad. That means not clear. And if I had to make a whole bunch of assumptions even further, the goal of this meeting to show stuff like this is probably of the nature of, how's it going? Is it going well? Okay, what are the 5 things that are going well? What are the 5 things that are not? What are the dimensions of those things? And that's a simple question. It's an important question, but it's a simple question. This, don't know what the question is. Therefore, you don't know what the answer is. Therefore, I can guess the guy spent a whole ton of time playing around with PowerPoint, getting really excited at how much detail he put in there without ever thinking about his audience or what he was going to say or what he wanted them to leave with. So the goal for all the slide stuff, really, instead of having confused slides or distracting slides, slides are a prop. They're in support of whatever it is that you're saying. If you need a bulleted list that actually supports you, great. I've had bulleted lists in the slide deck already. I'm not saying never use bulleted lists, but you have to make sure they are in service of a higher purpose. The audience's purpose, your purpose, and the point you're trying to make, and never allow them to be the focal point. When you start out in PowerPoint and you spend hours in there, you're going to tend to want to talk about your work because it's your thing you're proud of. You want to show it off. No one really is going to care. It came for reasons they care about that have nothing to do with your ability to make slides or not. So those are the 6 reasons for badness, for evil, to be less sarcastic or cynical. Flip these over, and these are the positive things that I hope that you'll think about next time you give a talk. First, just to summarize right off the bat, the amygdala, you are going to be afraid. Everyone is. Can't turn that off. You have to control the things you can. At a minimum, help your body out, get some exercise that morning. By far, that will make a radical difference. You're helping your body deal with the physiological fears involved in speaking. Second, practice. This is a performance. Whether you're pitching or giving a talk in a small group, you have some idea you're trying to convey. There are performance aspects to having arguments, even in the small. If you don't practice it, then you're making them the guinea pig. And if you care about your ideas, it's a stupid thing to do. You want to do a dry run. You want to run it by people, get their feedback on your pitch, how to make it sharper or tighter. Obvious, easy thing to do. No technology required. Fourth, about being interesting. Emotion counts. Enthusiasm counts. It's up to you to find a way to make it interesting yourself when you open your mouth. You could have the best idea in the world. If you seem bored by it, we know from the psychology, from the cognitive psychology data that we have, likelihood of people believing you and following your idea goes down. And then lastly, anything you use or show, slides, demos, whatever it is that you feel obligated to show, make sure it really supports the points and make sure it supports the reasons why people came. The slide should be a prop in support of whatever it is that you're doing. So those are my photo credits. And I'm on a book tour. I'm on the tail end of my book tour. I'm almost done. I've been all over the place. I've been in Boston. I've been in New York. I've been here all week. And tonight is my last lecture of the year, which I am so thrilled and excited about. And if you think I did an okay job today, and you know someone else who may want to come along and be entertained or learn about the amygdala and other cool brain science stuff, tell them to come along tonight, and we'll probably have a really good time because it's going to be, I get kind of goofy when it's my last lecture. So with that, I will open the floor for Q&A. And think about, you guys came here for a reason. And if I didn't give you what you wanted, we have time now to try and get at it. So who wants to start with a question?
If you could, please line up at the microphone over there.
Oh, okay. Who's got a question? Yeah, sorry, you got to engage your body to make a move.
Hi, I'm Charles. I was kind of interested in something that you mentioned kind of early on in the presentation. You said that you made a lot of mistakes kind of over your years during the presentation. So what are maybe one of the top or the top 2 things that you've done that you just think were stupid mistakes?
Okay, so the question was top mistakes. Well, the biggest one by far is not practicing. It's easy to see this stuff as, it's easy to see doing this as just something that's done. And until I started practicing before, well, the real story that led me down this path is why I'm in front of you today. When I was a manager at Microsoft, I worked on Internet Explorer, and I was asked to give a presentation in front of about 300 people. Biggest lecture I'd ever done. And I did it, and this is probably 10 years ago, so I was a lot younger then. And I watched the video of it. It was awful. It was just bad. I came across as angry and unpleasant. I gave off all the energy in the world of not wanting to be there, but like pissed at the audience that I had to be. And I was devastated by this, not because I'm a bad speaker, but again, I believed in the work my team was doing. I believed in the stuff we were making, and I'm up here representing it. And the fact that I behaved that way tainted whatever it was that I had to show. And I felt that was a kind of tragedy. So that's when I started saying, if I want to work on important stuff, if I want to have ideas and convince other people of this stuff, then I have to take responsibility for how I communicate, because that's how these ideas will make their way or not in the world. And so most of my stories and a lot of the stories in the book are what happens when you do this a lot. I mean, I've had everything go wrong. I mean, sometimes the mistakes are not your fault. I've had fire alarms go off in the middle of talks. I've had laptops crash. I've had hecklers, and people ask a question that goes on for 5 minutes, and I've had all that stuff happen. And then I go back and I'm like, oh, I got to get better at this. So I have gotten a lot better, and the book is largely what I learned from doing those things. So I bet any mistake you can imagine, I've probably done it at some point or another. But most of the mistakes people worry about are stupid, like typos. Like, who cares? Like, really, this is your big criticism of my hour that I spelled a word wrong? Like, come on. That's the criticism? Okay, I'll take that. Most of the things people worry about are trivial things, I think. Yeah, a book for you for asking the first question. Can you pass that back to him?
Oh, well, there you go. Scott, a question about practice. You were just talking about how you saw yourself in a video, and that helped sort of trigger the idea that you needed to get better. There's a book by a guy called Daniel Coyle, I think, about, I think it was called The Talent Code, just talking about intentional types of practice.
Yeah.
Do you have tips on
practice?
What are ways to practice that really kind of extract as much value out of that process?
Sure.
As possible?
So I can tell you what I do, and I recommend it, but you really need to do it yourself to find out what works best. The thing that I do is all the advice I just offered, I follow, I think, most of it. And I know that since I want this to feel natural, I don't spend hours making a slide deck and then start to practice. Yeah. That's a fatal. Then I got this thing I've spent hours on that I don't want to cut. Yeah. So I work the other way. I think on paper, just my list of points. What do I think people are going to want to know or questions they're going to answer? And I fleshed it out a little bit, like a rough outline, and then I start making slides. And then once I have 5 slides, I have a chunk that is like rough, I'll start practicing. This is ridiculous. It's embarrassing. I'll stand up in my office alone, or I'm in a hotel room alone, and I'll start doing it. Yeah. And I'll just go. And usually I'll go for a minute, then I'm like, I have no idea what comes next. Yeah. But then I'll sit down and go, well, if I can't get past a minute, then that part of my outline needs more fleshing. I need to think more about that. And then I keep going, and I iterate. And as I'm going, I'm refining my slides when I get stuck. And then eventually I got like 5 or 10 minutes of material that works. Yeah, yeah. And once I have that unit, then making the rest of it's much easier. Because I put this together, and that prevents the problem of overdoing the slides, and it enforces me thinking clearly about each part because I'm doing it a lot. Yeah. Then once I get up here, I've actually said this stuff before, and it might not be great, but it's way better than it was the first time I said it. Yeah. So the more you actually do it, stand up and do it, the better. A lot of people, they make their slides, and they sit there and like flip through, and they're thinking in their head what they're going to say. Doesn't count. Not practice. Right. That's thinking about practice. Yeah. Not the same thing. Yeah. You have to actually do it. It's physical.
Sounds like agile development.
Yeah. Yeah. No big schedules. Yeah. Little pieces. Yeah, book for you. If you want to come up and get it.
Hi, Scott.
I know you.
I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
So the first one is a lot of the times when we're trying to get ideas across and sort of pitches across, it's not kind of the big lecture halls, or it's like the small conference rooms. It might be just a few people there. It might be a lot of people on VC. It might be a few people. The kind of typical thing you do is you stay sitting. What about the energy in those kind of rooms? Different from the big rooms?
It's different, but the principles are the same, and our bodies are the same. So even though you're sitting down or whatever, if you're finding a way to describe whatever you're talking about, that you're enthusiastic about it, people's attention will tend to remain on you longer. So if You're bored, well, it's going to hurt what you're saying. So the principles, I
thing.
think, are the same. This format is extreme. It is more hierarchical. There's one speaker, and it's less interactive. It's all true, and that is a difference. But if I'm preparing to talk to 5 people, and I know I have these 3 important things I want to say, all the same stuff works. I don't want to make a 50-thing slide deck. I want to think about what questions am I going to get asked. That's actually a question I get a lot about, well, what do you do when people interrupt you? What do you do? Well, you plan for that. If you know who you're presenting with, you know your audience, who's likely to ask you know people's hot buttons, and you know the things they mostly like to go into rat holes about, so you plan for that, and you anticipate that.
Okay.
And you can't control it completely, but if you're afraid of that thing, then you practice to prepare for those situations.
Okay, and
Yeah.
my other question is probably on the other extreme with you probably know this one's coming up. It's about the back channels.
Yes.
And the presenting back channels.
back
And
channel.
There's been, so just to put this in context, that's usually at the bigger forums, and there might be some sort of Twitter back channel going on or other back channels, and sometimes these are presented. So
And what's the question?
what is your take on how a presenter should deal with this and kind of vibes from the audience?
Okay, so the question is, for those of you who don't know, at some conferences now where there's support of Twitter, they have a screen on, in some cases behind the speaker, that shows the Twitter stream. So as people in the audience it's up there. So you can do whatever you want. And so there have been some, bad experiences that speakers have had at some recent conferences. And I spoke at a conference recently where they had this up there. The short answer is that you never have anyone's complete attention anyway. You never do. And so, again, if people tune out, they want to do their laptop, it's going to happen. It's just natural. It's got nothing to do entirely with you. The better you are as a speaker, the better you match what you're talking about to what they're interested in, again, the $500 million thing, the more likely it is that you can keep their attention. But I know I never have everybody. Obama never has everybody. No one ever has everybody. The other challenge is that sometimes the way the room feels is different from how the room actually is. That the room can seem cold, but maybe there was some bad news that was mentioned that morning. Or maybe there could be something else going on in the environment that has nothing to do with you. And you have to have a kind of tune that out. You're going to do your thing, and you're listening, but you can't read too much into how they're responding, unless they're throwing things at you. Now, the Twitter thing, I'm like, great. If you guys are bored with me and you want to have a side conversation in the background, that's fine. Like, putting it behind me, you're now putting that in competition with what I'm trying to do. And that's just unfair. I mean, it's hard enough to speak. There's enough stresses and challenges in speaking at all. This is adding a degree of difficulty because now I can't even see what it is. And it allows anyone to participate. And I'm all for participation, but anyone? I mean, you're like, it's like heckler fodder. You're giving this environment where they have an abstract name where no one might even know who they are. How does that add value? So the question I ask about any of that stuff is what problem you're trying to solve. If the problem is people are bored, well, you probably need better speakers. Or you need to coach the speakers better so they're more attuned to what the audience wants. Then the need for the back channel is diminished. Not that it shouldn't exist, but the need for it goes away. Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
Quick question. It almost sounds like we should be making movies, not presentations. Do you think that that's a better way of thinking of it, of an arc and engaging people's attention that way?
Yes and no. So I believe that yes, in that you are thinking about narrative and story and keeping people engaged, so absolutely. But a movie is an artifact. It's a crafted production. And I'm a believer that I don't think most of the time that's what people want. They want something that feels natural and authentic and real, because that actually keeps your attention better. If you think that a lot of the stuff that people are afraid of, like their personality or the fact that they have opinions or they're animated, that those are negatives, that it's unprofessional to do those things. In my experience, it's just the opposite. So you don't want it to be so polished that it's its own, like it's a work of art. You want it to serve a purpose and the audience feels like you're a real person who really believes what you're saying. So I try to find a sweet spot with anything I use. I don't want that to overpower. Some people make beautiful slides. Like they're like beautiful. And they spend hours on this. And it can be overwhelming. That can draw way more of your attention away from the message or the points you're trying to make or the reasons people came. They probably didn't come to see works of art on your slides while you're talking about something else over them. That's probably not why they're there. So I do agree on the movie thing from a narrative and functional perspective, but not in the sense that you should have these perfectly constructed, highly produced, theatrical performance. No, I think that portrays what most people want most of the time. Yeah.
So one last question. The slide that you had up there with the heart rate and time.
Yeah.
It also, I think, correlates to another dimension of attention. So it's attention and time. Those are the two things that we're dealing with. But we have these artificial constructs or societal constructs of 60-hour or 60-minute presentations or meetings, and we're
Yes.
always bound by that.
Yes.
Are there ways that you found to be like, screw that, I'm going to give my presentation in 6 minutes?
Yeah.
The
I
meeting's
think
over in 12? Like,
no one is ever upset ever that you ended early. Like never, ever, 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 never, never, ever, ever, never happens. There's no recording in the history of the world the meeting ended early, except unless they paid to be there, right? I saw a lecture by David Mamet, the screenwriter, and he spoke, and I paid money to see this. He spoke for like 35 minutes and said, well, I don't want to take up more of your time, and phew, he's gone. I was like, what the fuck? Like, no, I paid money, I want more, But in general, less is better. Always less is better. And the best thing to do is what I tried to do here. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. 25 minutes is a decent chunk of time. Give people enough, like, is this guy credible or not? Then I open the floor. If there were no questions, that's a vote of we're done. If there are questions, that means at least for some people, there's more they wanted. Let's keep going. So I'm always like, I'll keep going as long as people have questions. There's no questions, well, I don't want to bore you anymore. Let's go. So standing meetings. Have you heard of standing meetings? Similar principle, right? Yeah.
So we have about 10 more minutes left. I wanted to ask a question. Then if anybody's on VC and wanted to ask something, you can jump in right after Scott's finished with the answer on this.
Okay.
So the name of the book is Confessions of a Public Speaker, which sort of confessions has like a bit of a negative connotation, like something they're revealing something bad. And I think when you were researching the book, you had solicited examples of when the presentation had gone horribly wrong. Is there some example or anecdote that stood out in your mind from that research?
Yeah, so there's a
I'd love to hear
chapter
it.
in the book. There's 2 chapters in the book that are related to that. One chapter in the book is called What to Do When Things Go Wrong. And it's an index of all the things people are usually afraid of, and they've all happened to me, and how to prevent them from happening and what to do if it happens anyway. So it's like this counter move thing in the book for the stuff people are usually worried about, although these things don't tend to happen that often. Then the last chapter in the book, I went around to all the other people who I know are sort of like me, who are authors or famous people who end up as a byproduct doing a lot of speaking. They're not actors or motivational speakers or anything. And I took all their best stories. So one of my favorites is Dan Rome. Do you guys know who Dan Rome is? Back of the Napkin. He wrote this great book called Back of the Napkin. And he has a story in there about speaking in Russia years ago. And midway through his presentation, a bunch of the equivalent of a SWAT team, the Moscow SWAT team comes barging in and with AK-47s and the whole deal, and go to the 4 corners of the room. They identify the person they're looking for. They grab him, and then they leave. Like, how do you follow that? Like, do you try to explain, or do you just pretend it didn't happen? So that's one of my favorite stories. That's all the things you worry about. Like, that's something to worry about. Like a terrorist group coming in and invading your thing, and once AK-47s enter the situation, it's a whole nother game, I think. Yeah.
Sure. Was there anybody on VC? I don't even know if anybody's there. Okay. Well, let's give Scott a round of applause. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, guys.